Hello all, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian. First up this week, The Social Secret to Olivia's Wishes, 4th of February 2015. I see that 19-year-old Olivia Mead, a student, is contesting the will of her late father, Michael Wright. Heiress claims millions for home, shoes, piano. News, 3rd of February. Despite being offered a $3 million trust fund when she turns 30 and an allowance until then, she feels she should be provided with a house worth at least $2.5 million, as well as the necessities of life, such as a $250,000 diamond-encrusted bass guitar and a $1.2 million crystal-encrusted grand piano. This list of demands goes on for a bit longer, but the bottom line is that money certainly does not buy class. Perhaps this young woman might think about what she might contribute to society, rather than what more her family can do for her. Gary Klein, Inglewood. So this case recently made the headlines here. So this is a inheritance case regarding one of our mining magnates here. So I think Michael Wright died. And he left his money to his 4 children. The value of his estate was about $1.5 billion, and he left the money divided very unequally amongst his 4 children. So he had 3 children with his wife, who essentially had relatively equal share of about 500 million odd each, and then there his secret child that he had with a mistress, Olivia Mead, who got $3 million. So she got less than 1/100th of what her half-siblings got, as it were. She is contesting this in court to argue that she should have a much fairer distribution of the funds, as is fairly common here. This is not unusual. Essentially, what you put in your will is contestable here, so that people have... there is a legal expectation of fair distribution amongst your offspring. The fact that she was the child of his mistress rather than his wife is not sufficient grounds, it would seem, for him to essentially give her a far less share of his wealth. Now, because of the way the legal system works... Now, that said, she was given $3 million. Now, a lot of people wrote into the paper to say that she should have just been happy with that. And I think on one level I can understand that, but on another level that's almost like saying that she should also be happy that other people got extravagant, that her half-siblings were receiving somewhere in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. And it seems to me that that's a reasonable thing to say, hang on a sec, this should be fair. Now, I honestly think there should be much greater inheritance taxes, so that at least some of this money is flowing back to the state of Western Australia, at least, and society at large, because it doesn't seem to me that the children of somebody who's made $1.5 billion from mining here in WA somehow have a sort of a strong claim on the entirety of his wealth. That's another issue. The legality of it is when she was contesting this is essentially she has to put forward a list of expenses that justify what she's asking for. So I'm not quite sure how much she's asking for. It's in the tens of millions at least. And she basically had to put together a list of things that justified why she should receive tens of millions. It's not enough in law to simply say, well, this is an uneven split of things. She really needed to put forth something that said, well, actually, this is why I deserve to have the tens of millions that I think I'm entitled to. And this did involve putting together a laundry list of all sorts of things. And, of course, it comes out as extravagant. Now, I would question how reasonable it was for the lawyers to go, yeah, let's ask for a diamond-encrusted bass guitar, crystal-encrusted grand piano. But certainly, the idea that she is entitled to a several million-dollar property, and there are all sorts of other things about wine and food and drink and all of that kind of stuff. And the argument essentially is that she is entitled to live at a lifestyle to which she's accustomed, given that her father was a billionaire. That's the way it usually plays out in court, and it does make the person look like they are money grabbing. And unfortunately, that's the only way that they can justify their claim on the money, because a simple claim of fairness is not enough. I would like to see that changed in law. I think a simple claim of fairness probably should be enough, but also I think inheritance taxes would go a long way as well. Anyway, next up. It's not murder, 6th of February 2015. Taxi passenger Grant Collard's drug-fueled rage resulted in appalling and terrifying behaviour, but the taxi driver, Lindsay Ferguson, died from a heart attack due to an underlying medical condition. Passenger guilty of murder by fright, News 29th of the 1st. A murder conviction surely relies upon establishing that the accused formed an intention to kill. How was this established, given that the accused was acutely intoxicated, possibly psychotic, and the victim suffered no serious injury? The charge should have been downgraded. AC Martis Dalkeith. So a couple of things going on here. Firstly, the fact that the guy was found guilty means that in law, certainly it was not established that he was likely to have been psychotic. It must have been proved beyond reasonable doubt that this person did understand what they were doing at the time and that what they were doing was wrong at the time, psychotic or not. So put that to one side. When you say the victim suffered no serious injury, I think you're confusing things. So what actually happened was, this guy, Grant Collard, got into the cab. He then terrorised the taxi driver, threatened all sorts of things, stabbed portions of the taxi itself, forced the taxi driver to drive him to various locations to get drugs. He then used drugs while in the cab and continued making threats and stabbing portions of the cab, but not the taxi driver. And eventually, the driver, Lindsay Ferguson, had a heart attack and died. As a result of this, the passenger who'd been threatening all this stuff was charged with murder. Now, there is this common misconception by people who don't understand the law that in order to be charged with murder or first-degree murder or something like that, there has to be an intention to kill. That's not the case at all. Premeditated murder here, so the sort of the most serious murder charge, and in our laws here generally follow the English tradition of common law. So anywhere we have common law jurisdiction, we have similar standards, and it's not that far different in America. So the sort of highest level of murder, premeditated murder, merely requires an intent to cause grievous bodily harm that actually ended up causing murder. So when I shoot at somebody, even if I can establish that I'm not intending to kill them by firing at them, the fact that I was intending to cause grievous bodily harm, and if I did in fact cause them to die, that is sufficient for it to be premeditated murder. That's a fairly standard legal thing which has escaped the notice of many people. So there is no necessity to show that the person intended to kill. Also, in many jurisdictions, depending on what the charge is of murder, it's enough to show that it was reasonably foreseeable. So even if I didn't intend to kill somebody, if I'm throwing knives at you with no intent of hitting you, but I just want to scare you, and I miss and I kill you, I can be charged with murder, because it would be reasonably foreseeable that throwing knives at you might kill you. That fits nicely under murder. But what actually happened in this case is something slightly different, and is what's often called felony murder, which is very common in the US and in common law here as well, although it has been abolished in most of the UK. And the idea here is that if, while you are committing a sufficiently serious crime, a felony, particular felonies, you end up killing somebody, even if that wasn't your intent, you can still be charged with murder. So if I'm involved in an armed robbery with no intent to kill somebody, but during the armed robbery things go wrong and I accidentally shoot and kill somebody, I can be charged with murder, because what I was doing was showing complete reckless disregard for other people's lives, and it really is my responsibility for having killed them. Now, in this case, the charge that the person was, the crime that he was committing that caused the person to die was kidnapping. And kidnapping is considered an incredibly serious charge. So the fact that he'd threatened this driver and made him drive around and do all these things, and it had resulted in terrifying this guy to death, classified it as murder. It wasn't necessarily reasonable, foreseeable. He couldn't have necessarily envisaged that this person would have died of a heart attack. But it's not that much of a stretch to imagine that going on a drug-fueled rampage while holding somebody hostage in their own taxi, it's not that far. It's fairly foreseeable that you are showing a reckless disregard for their safety and their life, and so therefore murder. most people might be more comfortable calling it manslaughter, but in terms of legal distinctions, there's not a huge difference here. Manslaughter generally is when you're committing a crime that is less serious than something like kidnapping. So anyway, that's why he was charged with murder, and found guilty in this case. Fine Dandy Burgers, 7th of February 2015. The article, Fashion All-Important to Councillors, News 31st to the 1st, really got up my nose. It told how Perth ratepayers last year reimbursed $83,000 to City of Perth's 8 councillors and Lord Mayor Lisa Scafidi for clothing, phone bills, dry cleaning, taxis, haircuts and corporate gifts, etc. I accept genuine business costs, such as phone bills and taxi fares, but claims for clothing, hairdressing and dry cleaning are a joke. Why should ratepayers pay for these costs? According to City of Perth councillor Lily Chen, a well-dressed councillor means he or she takes their position seriously and their conduct of their civic duties shall reflect their neat and nice presentation. What a lot of waffle. John Miller, Marmion. Okay, so I actually did some research into this one and looked it up. So the Lord Mayor and councillors aren't actually paid a salary as such. They get what's called an allowance. And I presume they get expenses paid on top of this. Now, up to a couple of years ago, this was a pitifully small amount. It was about $7,000 for a councillor per year, and about $50,000 for the Lord Mayor per year. And the reason for the disparity is it's seen that the councillors' jobs are not full-time positions, they are sort of part-time positions that you do as an adjunct to your normal business, and a Lord Mayor position is a full-time position. But a full-time position as Lord Mayor of the capital of our state, and Lord Mayor, of the major sort of central business district of our state capital, $50,000 a year is woefully small. So a couple of years ago, they upped all of these rates. So it's now $30,000 for a councillor per year, as a sort of a part-time position, and $175,000 for the Lord Mayor, which sounds like a lot, but is certainly on par with other capital cities around Australia. Now, $83,000 last year was paid as allowances to the 8 councillors plus the Lord Mayor. That works out to be about $9,000 per councillor, give or take. Some of that will be things like taxis and phone bills. Some of that is other things. I'm not quite sure what the breakdown is. And I think the main part of the problem is this, is that like most jobs, there is a standard of professionalism and professional presentation expected of the Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor has a lot of civic duties where they have to attend things, and they have to make presentations, and they have to present well. And so they have to look good to represent the city and the state in general. And all of that is completely accepted. No matter what job you've got, there is some kind of dress code and some kind of expectation of your presentation. The problem is that with positions like the Lord Mayor here and parliamentary type positions, is that we don't do what we do in every other industry, where we simply bundle that into the salary and you pay your staff a reasonable wage, and you leave it up to them to decide how much of that they're going to spend in order to keep themselves presented nicely. What we do with politicians and all the way down to our mayors is that we say, here's your salary or allowance in this case, and plus we'll give you expenses. And the problem with that is that it means that we get to see how much they're choosing to spend on things like their presentation. My take would be that, if this is an issue, and say she's spending, I don't know, she's a Lord Mayor, say she's spending $25,000 a year on her presentation and things like that, is that we should just bump up the salary to $200,000 and just say it's all inclusive. So you've got to work out how much of that you're going to spend on your clothing and your shoes and stuff like that. And part of the job expectation is that you'll be dressed nicely. We pay you $200,000 a year, you can afford to dress nicely. That would certainly be, I think, a much better way of doing it. It's the same with politicians, is that we give them all these sort of entitlements, these travel entitlements and expense claims for left, right, centre. We should just put the salary up to a point where we can say, no, you get to make a choice about how much you're going to spend on these various bits and pieces, and we don't really care. But for some reason, that's not the way it goes. I would like to see it all bundled into a salary and let people make their own choices. Public Health Services, 10th of February 2015. Andrew Grice decried arrangements for the new Midland Hospital, which will be run for the public by St John of God Healthcare without provision of contraceptive services. No place for religion in healthcare, letters 6th of February. On the contrary, Mr Grice, many believe there is no place for the deliberate termination of healthy children or fetuses on a hospital campus promoting health and well-being. Nancy Cox, Ascot. So, eastern suburbs of Perth, Midland Hospital, Swan District's hospital is being in the process of being shut down, and a new Midland Hospital is being built and will open soon. And as a way of saving money, it was put out for tender to be run by private organisations, and the winning tenderer was St John of God Healthcare, which also runs several private hospitals around in Perth. And this is a model that's worked here previously in other hospitals. The problem came that it then became apparent that St John of God was refusing because they're a Catholic organisation, refusing to provide any contraceptive services because that would be against their religion. Like organisations have religions, apparently. This has led to a bit of kerfuffle because now there's this. Essentially, this has made has the potential to make abortion and other health. Other contraceptive services unavailable to people in that area, and it's a particularly the suburbs it's serving are relatively poor suburbs, and so we're talking about people who are particularly vulnerable to those kind of issues, unable to travel necessarily to get access elsewhere. So then the government's had to work out, well, how are we going to provide these services? And they're going to have to build another clinic that'll have to be run by some other organisation perhaps, and it's not quite the cost saving that it was originally seen. So the problem with the letter is suggesting that St John of God have some right to not provide these services, even though they want to run a hospital on behalf of the government. So let's make it clear, this is a public hospital, this is not a private hospital. So the private hospitals that St John of God have at least a couple of private hospitals here in Perth, and they don't provide things like abortions or other contraceptive services. In fact, the staff So the doctors usually don't actually work for the hospital, they contract themselves in, but the staff of the hospitals aren't actually allowed to consult with patients on issues that would put them at odds with their faith. So they can't talk to you about condom use, for example. You have to talk to your public doctor or your personal doctor about that. Whatever. That's fine. It's a private hospital. I couldn't care any less. The problem with this is that they are running a public hospital here on behalf of the government. And so I think on one level it's reasonable for them to be expected to do something about this. This is an essential service for a significant number of people in the community. And family planning just across the board is a very important thing that hospital staff should be allowed to talk about. And it shouldn't just be shunted off. Now, I think the biggest problem here is about the tendering process, is that when it was tendered, I can't quite understand why it wasn't part of the contract that these are the services you need to provide if you're going to run this hospital, to which St John of God could then say, well, we can't provide that, and it's either, well, and there's two options there. One, either maybe they just can't tender for it, full stop, or two, they have to come up with some kind of alternative whereby another organisation will provide those services while St John of God provides the rest of the hospital services, which is what's going to end up happening anyway. But I think the onus should be on St John of God to put that in their tendering documents. That way, we can look at what the full cost is, because those other organisations that tendered for this presumably would have had to include the cost of doing contraceptive services and abortions, which I don't know if it's significant or not. As it stands, it looks like Marie Stopes will be running that, and they provide it in their private clinics anyway, so it's not a big deal. But I think it is just a sign of when you do these kind of when you do put things out to tender, is the government here needs to ensure that there are requirements on the tenderers, that they can't just shirk their responsibility because they happen to be a Catholic organisation. You want to be a Catholic organisation, you don't want to do abortions, that's fine, but you have no right to demand that nobody can then receive them. And this letter writer, if you're against abortion, that's fine, don't have one. But this is a public hospital which needs to service everybody else, and abortion is perfectly legal here and in most of the rest of the developed world. And so it's perfectly reasonable for public hospitals to be expected to provide abortions, even if it's against your personal views. Lastly, give him a break, 10th of February 2015. Okay, Tony Abbott has not got the personality which is expected these days when confronted by the media. But this country does not need someone in charge who is popular but cannot make the right decisions. It's someone who has the ability to introduce legislation that guides this country along an even path. Yes, Abbott has made one or two minor mistakes, and Labor raves on about broken promises. But when these promises were made, Abbott was not aware that our debt was so enormous. Mike Hilton, Willerton,